12-step prayer is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming willing. Willing to surrender what we cannot carry alone, and trust that healing begins with honesty, humility, and grace.
Welcome back to The Conversation. I'm Nick Robinson, and I'm here again with Rick Lanham as we continue our Table Talk series talking about the 12 steps of recovery as we recover from all kinds of things in our life and experience healing from God and from working the steps, from addictions and from shopping, from overeating, from all kinds of, from stress, all the kinds of things that just kind of claim our lives. Today's conversation is a little bit different. We're going to be talking about prayer and the role that prayer plays specifically in the 12-step process. We're going to talk about prayer generally. We're going to talk about prayer and recovery. And then by the end of this conversation, we will be talking about some specific prayers that are paired with the steps of the 12-step recovery process. And so I'm going to turn to Rick first. And I want to say, Rick, as we've talked to people and had them at this table, like moving stories from people in recovery, and step one, so much of or step two is all of this it's focused on a higher power, focused on God. You and I, we're Christians. We're going to talk about the Christian God. All of our guests, Christian God. And one of the ways that we relate to God is through prayer. Not everyone may know exactly what prayer is, though. So I want to ask you to give us a simple definition, as simple as you can make it, maybe, and then we can get more complex from there. Give us what is prayer?
The easiest way that I could describe prayer, let me start with a basic premise, is at creation, we were created to be in relationship with God.
Absolutely.
Unlike all other created beings, our purpose as human beings is to be in relationship and fellowship with God. That being said, I'm in relationship with you, with Dean, with my mom, with my sister. I have friends, for instance, in California, Nashville, Florida, wherever. And because of that distance, there's something that sometimes in that separation, I just want to have conversation with them. So prayer becomes with God that form of conversation. So sometimes, whether it's by text or by email or by phone or whatever, I just say, I just pray they understand. So for me, pray means people relating and yearning. P-R-A-Y. People relating and yearning. So when I pray, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm yearning and I'm relating to God. So it's not something that, when I was little, Mom would say, did you do your prayers or did you say your prayers? It's not an event. It's not something that it's just, I think we oftentimes make it something harder than it needs to be.
Yeah.
Whereas just inside of me, I'm just wanting to have a relationship, and there's just something that yearns for me to be in fellowship, friendship, relationship. So people relating and yearning for connection.
Yeah, I often talk about it this way. So if I love my spouse, but I never tell my spouse that I love her, she's not really going to know that I love her.
Correct.
Like if we live in the same house and never talk to each other, it's not going to feel like we have a marriage. Right. And so for me, I always kind of tell people that prayer is just talking to God. God already knows all the things that you have to tell God. God knows all of the things going on inside of you, all of the things that you need, even better than you do. But the act of the conversation is still immensely important to talk, but then also to give space for hearing back from God
And
as well.
I was just going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
In that type of relationship, if you don't ever listen to her,
Mm-hmm.
there's no space for a relationship either.
Yeah.
So it becomes a relationship only if you are not only talking, but
Yes.
also listening.
Yeah, because I'm not her boss telling her what to do all of the time, or she's not my therapist just listening to my problems all of the time. We're in a mutual relationship where we both give and take, and support one another, but also benefit from the support of each
And
other.
because there is that love relationship, that's where the yearning comes
Yeah.
in, and it's mutual. So people relating and yearning,
Mm-hmm.
you end up with that pray.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think people worry about, like, are there specific words that we have to use when we pray?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus says, I no longer call you brothers, I call
Mm-hmm.
you friend. And so I don't pre-think what I'm going to say to a friend any more than you and I script out the conversations that
Yep.
we're having here.
Yeah, and I always tell people, like, I don't know, I feel like from old church worship styles where it was all scripted and it was all liturgical, there is value in a lot of that. Liturgical worship, has been tested for centuries, and the rhythms and the patterns become really important and enriching. I've been enriched both from liturgical pattern written styles of worship and then more spontaneous styles of worship too. But when we just see written prayers and we hear people pray with like flowery language, that can be intimidating to some people, I think. Correct. And so I try to counsel people that, like, if you don't know how to pray, just imagine that you're at a table and that Jesus is sitting across from you. Just start the conversation and tell Jesus what you would tell whoever you're sitting with. Someone that you love, that you can trust, someone that loves you and is there for you. And so it's just a conversation. It's as simple as a conversation.
Well, I think that's a wise counsel there. And you and I have had conversations in previous times where we look at the Lord's Prayer recorded in Matthew 5, and it scripts for us what to say. But I think that is more contextually start with praise, start with worship, adoration of Him, then followed with gratitude for the needs and the food and the provision, and on down with protection and that sort of thing in terms of the types of things that should be included in your prayer. But right before that is the promise that your Father in heaven knows what you need before you even ask. And I think that's the important context, because in a relationship, you know what your wife needs. She knows what your needs are. That's part of that relationship aspect. So when I think about that from a friend, Tanner that was on for step one, Mike Gibson, step 2, Lacey in step 3. We're friends, we're acquaintances, because we have that interactive connectivity in that relationship. We go on with some of the other interviewers or interviewees that we're going to have. These are people that I've known. We're in the recovery community here in town. So that's because we have had interaction where I speak to them, they speak to me. We know each other. That's because we've spent time. Yeah. That's what happens in prayer. You spend time communicating, but in this case, you're communicating in prayer, communicating with God.
Yeah, and a good conversation, a good relationship changes you.
Right.
So if you talk to God, you're going to be changed by that. Rick, what kind of advice do you give people on when to pray?
I guess the question is, do you predetermine when you're going to talk to your wife?
Sometimes.
Yeah, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. A lot of times I find that people are more in a space, especially in recovery, that they don't think to pray unless they're in a desperate situation. That's an obvious one, especially in recovery. That we've talked about hitting that rock bottom. And there's prayers of desperation. On the other hand, There's prayers of gratitude. I'm so thankful. Oh, but then again, it's thank God I'm out of that one.
Yeah.
You know.
Uh-huh.
On the other hand, you want to share those times of joy. You know, those times of everything's going great, man. This is really going well. That's when you'd share something with a friend. You know, you find a great sale, you call your friend and go, "You're not going to believe this." You find
Yeah.
a good restaurant, man, you're not going to believe this. But just sharing life as life is unfolding, I find myself now talking to God a lot.
Yeah.
You know, Paul talks about praying without ceasing.
Absolutely.
I'm not talking about, you know, sitting down in my bed or on my knees on a day in and day out basis and thinking of somebody who is in the active worship act of praying without ceasing as something that their prayer is an active doing that. I'm thinking of a mindset, an attitude of prayer, so that, you know, I always have this thing where I have a word that I constantly use throughout a year. And my word for 2026 is becoming. Am I becoming more of a man of prayer? A man who prays about things as they're happening, as they're occurring. So if somebody says, "Will you pray for this?" Yes, I will pray. I will talk to God about your situation as I come and as I go throughout my day. I will keep that in my mind, and as it's in my mind, as I'm thinking about it, I will pray for your situation as it comes. Paul says in Philippians, "I thank my God every time that I remember you."
Yeah.
So if Nick comes across my mind, I will immediately pray for Nick and his family, or Nick and the church.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I've got to stop my car, get on my knees, close my eyes. I'm certainly not going to close my eyes while I'm driving, but every time that Nick
Not
and the
recommended.
church and Asbury and the ministries that are listed in our Faith Promise Bulletin, every time that Nick comes to my mind, I will become a man of prayer on behalf of Nick and the church.
And I just want to, you know, for me, there's going to be set times that if we go back to the metaphor, my relationship with my wife, date nights are important. There are going to be times when I set aside specific times to pray or to talk with her. And so you might do that too in prayer life. You might say, I am going to pray every morning, or I am going to pray every evening, or there's someone in the church that every night at 7 o'clock an alarm goes off on her phone and reminds her to be in prayer in that moment. Like, so to attach it to some of those schedules can be important, but then also combining it with that idea of praying without ceasing. I was listening to a book while I was driving to a church meeting the other day, and it was about the Desert Fathers. And there was someone who had prayed and prayed and prayed a prayer with their words, and eventually they got to this point where they were unable to pray it, but they found that they were praying it in their hearts, even as they weren't with their words. And so they were, even without saying or thinking the word specifically, it had become a pattern of their life and of their being. And so there's that range of prayer, like the specific, God, here's the things that I need, here's the people I need you to be with. There's the time of listening, and then there's just like a time of noticing and lifting kind of unconsciously or semi-consciously things before God. Well, I think that's going to wrap up our brief introduction on prayer. If you are interested in more prayer specifics, there are endless books and experiences and even quite a bit of scripture that talks about prayer. You can read it in the Psalms, in the New Testament. You can read about a lot of different kinds of prayer, which we can't get into all of it, but some of those basics, like it's like a conversation. You can pray anytime, but it might help you to set a pattern. There aren't special words, but it's about our hearts and God changing us as much as anything. Those basics, I think, are really good for us to kind of touch on now. And now we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment to talk about prayer more specifically as it relates to recovery communities.
Great.
You're joining us for the conversation. I'm Nick. This is Rick, and we'll see you in a moment.
Okay.
Through 12-step prayer, we learn that surrender is not defeat. It is the doorway to freedom, restoration, and a life rebuilt one faithful step at a time.
Welcome back to the conversation. Table Talk, we continue to talk about the 12 steps of recovery with Nick. And Rick, it rhymes, is just a little too convenient. So, Rick, we started with this general conversation about prayer. I'm super comfortable there, right? I'm a pastor. I've been talking about prayer, been practicing prayer for a long time. You know, sometimes my prayer life is super strong. Sometimes it's a little bit weaker, but I'm used to talking about and doing prayer to some degree. What I'm not used to is I'm not in recovery. And so I don't know how prayer and recovery always go hand in hand together. One of the things I've heard through social media or movies or TV, I don't know where I picked this up, but that the serenity prayer was frequently used in recovery circles or by people in recovery or whatever. Rick, is that true? Do people really embrace this serenity prayer? And if so, what is the serenity prayer?
Okay. Well, first off, I think I told you in the first episode, I spent 22 years wearing your hat as a pastor. So I'm real comfortable talking about prayer in that arena. And then I spent a lot of years in recovery, so I've worn that hat. The serenity prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's the short version.
That's the version I've heard, right?
Right. And that's the one that's read and said and I would say chanted and clung to, literally clung to at any 12-step meeting. Okay. And when I say clung to, I didn't know it's going to get emotional.
Yeah.
Literally clung to by everybody that's deeply, deeply impacted by recovery and addiction of any kind, because acceptance is hard for any addict who is in step one, whose life is unmanageable and who is broken in rock bottom.
And so this prayer is powerful because it's naming something real.
The first part is the acceptance part, because it takes huge amounts of humility to just go, I can't do this. I can't do this. And then getting to the place where they have the courage first to change, to accept and to change the things that they can, and even more difficult as they move through the steps to get to a place where they have the wisdom and discernment to know the difference of what they can and can't change. And part of that is working into step 4 and recognizing what they can't change. I mean, there's some things that they just can't change, which is other people. Some of the circumstances they can and can't change, their culture, their environment. There's just some stuff they can't change. Yeah. Being able to surrender what they can and can't give up. Life is hard. So I have met and I've been in spaces where literally throughout the day I've heard other people say, this serenity prayer, I said it over and over and over and over in my head. God, give me the serenity to accept what I can't change. Give me courage, 10 minutes at a time, half hour at a time, an hour at a time. Then an hour turned into a half a day, and a half a day moved into a day. And then they said 24 hours. They called their sponsor, their discipler, or their mentor, and they said, I made it through a day. They said, good, do it again. Made it through 2 days, and then they made it through a week, and the next thing they knew, they hadn't bought a scratch-off ticket, or they hadn't looked at porn, or they hadn't drank, or they hadn't used, and that week turned into a month, and that month turned into 2 months, and turned in, next thing you knew, they were taking a 90-day token, or 6-month token, or whatever it was, and all of a sudden, that had turned into a year. And then it turned in, and just this morning I was in a meeting at St. Paul's and somebody got a 7-year token. Last Friday I was a guy got a 28-year token, and we're going, wow. So I look at that, but that's just from the short version.
Yeah. Well, and it's a prayer that scales. Even the short version works on hour 1 and year 7. We are always needing the wisdom, the acceptance, the courage.
Right.
Anytime. We always need those. Well, okay, you've got me curious, though. What is the long version of this prayer?
Well, the long version then is in the wisdom to know the difference. And then the long version continues living one day at a time. There's a catchphrase. Those little phrases that they put on plaques that hang in the
Yeah.
rooms of all these different.
Hang in there.
Hang in there, one day at a time. Then lies dead. We do recover, Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life. Oh, man. So that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next.
Wow.
Amen.
So we talked about that value and the power of the short prayer. What does the long version give us that the short version misses out on?
Well, it reiterates a couple of things for me. The first one is surrender. Well, one day at a time.
Yeah.
There's another one that hangs on the wall of a lot of the rooms that says surrender to win. First time I saw that one, was like, that's so counterintuitive.
Yeah, and that's like backwards
that's
for
an
how we think.
Oxymoron,
Yeah.
if I ever heard one. Surrender to win. Also, the promise of peace. I always come back to John 14. Says, "Peace I give to you, not as the world understands it, but my peace I give to you." It's like, well, the world's concept of having peace. And it takes me back to the promises from the 9th step that says, you will understand the word serenity and you will know peace. I'm like, this is a peace that really the world would not understand what it means to have turmoil, chaos, unmanageability, absolute confusion leave.
Yeah.
And the peace that comes, the peace that the world chases and what they're after to define serenity and peace is not the kind of peace that comes when any form of addiction. We go back to step one, we admitted that we were powerless over. Once that powerless chaos, confusion disappears from the mind, and what I described in that first episode of that war, the battle that goes on, like I described in Romans 7, once that battle is gone and it just lifts. And it's not based on conditions or circumstances that this world understands. It's inside of Rick. When that goes away, that kind of peace, nobody gets that but me. And then it says, I surrender to his will so that I can, that's a reasonable happiness in this world, but I can't imagine what that supreme happiness is going to be like in the next world.
So it's pointing us towards
I look
hope,
forward
too.
to it, and that's why, I came to believe that a power, and then turned my will and my life over, like Lacey talked about in episode, well, it was our 4th episode, but it was in step 3. And what was the word for that? It was hope.
Yeah.
That word was hope.
So here in this prayer, I notice a few things that relate to what we talked about in the first segment of this conversation. One, this is a written prayer. Like, this is a prayer that has been used for many, many years for people to use and have found power in it. And so, when we don't have our own words, there are these kinds of resources to fall back on. But just because it's written doesn't mean it's not powerful or if it's not authentic. I mean, we talked about praying without ceasing. And so earlier in this part of the conversation, you talked about, people might be praying it for 20 minutes. Like, give me 20 minutes of courage and strength and wisdom and acceptance. And then, but it's a prayer that you can pray in any moment. So like it was from, you went down those 20 minutes, half a day, 2 days, all of that. So this is one of the ways that you might pray without ceasing, is by clinging to something like this that gives you hope. So I got this real sense that this prayer has been meaningful for you. Do you see it also impacting other people's lives in recovery?
I do. It's kind of like why would somebody write down their wedding vows? It's because you're so caught up in the moment of that particular day. There's so much blur going on with all the stuff. You might want to go back and read them with your wife at some point in time to remind yourself what did you actually say. And so I have gone back, just like with the short version, and I've dissected that.
Yeah.
What does it mean to accept? Lord, grant me the serenity. So I look up the word serenity. I look up the word accept. Courage, what does that mean? Change, what does that mean? Wisdom, what does that mean? I've gone back through and studied living. What does it mean to truly live, to be alive? What does it mean to surrender? So you go back, you look at your vows. What does it mean when you said to your wife, for better or worse, till death do us part, okay? So as you start to really get into the depth of meaning, same thing with the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 5, to say, nothing is impossible with God, from Luke 1:37, okay? So if I'm going to pray, if I'm going to say any kind of prayer in faith, say a prayer in faith. I think sometimes when we say our prayers, we say, if it's your will. Well, that's like saying, well, if you could do it, God. Well, God, nothing's impossible. Of course, God can do it. And Jesus said, to the measure that you believe. Okay, Thomas says, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. So the question is, am I believing that God can do it? Or do I have the faith when I pray that God's going to answer my prayer? So in recovery, when I asked God, lift this obsession from me, whatever my obsession is, whatever my addiction is. And I say, Lord, please take this, lift this obsession and this desire to use or to buy or to eat. Take this obsession that's supposedly supposed to take these feelings away, whatever this mindset is, and take this away from me. If you want me to, if you want it not to be there anymore. Am I saying, God, do you want this for me? The Father knows what he wants what I want before I even ask. Of course I want it, or wouldn't be praying it. But God, do you want it? Of course he wants it. He wants my love and affection and my worship more than he wants me to worship that scratch off.
Yeah.
That's why he said, seek me first, not seek the food first or seek the scratch off for the money. So the question is, do I have the faith when I pray that he's going to answer my prayers? That's why prayer has to be the relationship. My relationship and yearning for him has to supersede my desire for whatever that thing is that I'm trying to fill in that heart. That's intense if I understand the nature of what is it that I'm plugging into more than I'm plugging into him.
Now, so these prayers give us fertile ground to kind of start some faithful adventures, like looking up words, claiming it as our own, not just leaving it simple, but as a place to launch deeper faith from. Well, this is
I'm not plugging into the script. I'm plugging into him. The script is just the wire that connects me to him.
Sure. Well, let's wrap up this part of our conversation. We have some more specific prayers to talk about in the third part of our conversation today. We'll be right back.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Recovery begins where pride ends, in the simple, brave prayer for help.
Welcome back to Table Talk as we continue to talk about prayer in relation to recovery and the 12 steps therein. One of the things that I've learned from Rick in this is that there is a prayer that goes with every step. We haven't had time to talk about that in our step work conversations. Right. So that's kind of the impetus behind this whole conversation now, is to cover some of these prayers that people would say during the steps and why and just what they're about, that kind of thing.
Right.
You know, it reminds me of a piece of scripture, that tells us to lean not on our own understanding. So these prayers are prayers that are part of the 12-step tradition that each person is kind of presented with, I don't know, the opportunity to pray or is required to pray. I don't know how that works. I assume you can't force people to do it. But they've stood the test of time. And as you're going through this process, I think maybe you learn to trust these prayers. Well, I don't know, Rick, you tell me. Give me an introduction to these 12 prayers.
Well, it's interesting, and it took me a while to figure it out because I really didn't know either.
Yeah.
When I came into the program, so to speak, built in with the literature of the big book of AA, there's a step. There's a promise. There's 12 steps, 12 traditions, 12 promises. There's a prayer for each of the steps, and I didn't know that either. But as I was going through it, then I realized that for each step there was a promise. But then my sponsor said, "Well, there's also a prayer." But again, prayer is one of those things that people are just kind of uncomfortable with.
Absolutely.
And certainly some people, especially if they don't have any kind of upbringing or they're not exposed to church, the thought of praying, talking to God or talking to a higher power just seems kind of weird. And they're like, "Well, I don't know how to pray. I don't know what to do." Even less so comfortable praying in front of people when they say, "Well, if I was going to pray, what would I say?" Well, so built into the each step, there's a prayer, but some of them are really emphasized. I won't say they're pushed.
There's like milestone prayers almost because they're milestone steps.
Kind of at the point that you, at the end of each section or at the end of each prayer, it'll say something like this. Kind of like in Matthew 5 when Jesus said, "But when you pray, say
pray like
something
this."
like this." And then he says, "Our Father." And that's what's known as the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father, depending on which religious tradition you've been raised in or been exposed to. I brought a couple of them, like the third step prayer, especially at the end of the give our will and our lives over to the care of God. And that one says, "God, I offer myself to you," or to thee, offer myself to you to build with me and to do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do your will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those that I would help of your power, your love, and your way of life. May I do your will always." And for somebody who's never prayed, again, like I said just a few minutes ago, you kind of break that down and you realize that here I've just finished the first 3 steps. My life is unmanageable. That's huge. I've come to grips with the fact that there is somebody bigger than Rick, bigger than me, that can help me. And now I've decided to turn my will and my life over to the care of this person. But I don't really know how to do that. But since I've done that, I'm going to believe that the bondage of self, I'm going to turn my will over. I'm going to build with me and do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of myself so that I can better do your will. So now I've turned it over. That's factored in here. So the verbiage in this prayer, the words in this prayer have been put down on paper, and this prayer is written so that take away those difficulties, that victory over those difficulties, that victory over them can give witness to those around me, give witness to those that I would help with what? With your power, your love, and your way of life. May I do your will always. So for somebody who doesn't know really how to pray, this kind of becomes a template. And gradually from this written prayer, this plug-in script that I referred to earlier, from this, I can learn how to turn this, own this, and eventually make it my own. So it's not that this becomes something that I just memorize and say over and over and over. It's something that from this, it becomes mine. And then gradually it becomes a comfort level thing where I take somebody else's words and make it my own, and it becomes not something print, but something that becomes imprinted.
Well, I
My
want to get really basic for a second, Rick. When do you pray this prayer? If you're on step 3, you got the step 3 prayer, these beautiful words, these powerful words. When do you pray it?
Go back to the serenity prayer. It's like every single time that I need to say, Lord, I feel like I'm starting to get back into bondage to self. I start to feel like right now I feel in bondage to my thought life. I feel like I feel in bondage again to the need to comfort myself with food. Relieve me of the bondage to self. I feel like I'm in bondage to the need to comfort myself with the purchase of something off of QVC right now. Relieve me from the bondage of self so that I can do your will rather than Rick's will. Take away my difficulties so that I can have, victory over this right now. I'll pray this prayer. Maybe not the whole thing, just segments of it, Lord.
Yeah.
Help me. So now I've not only got the serenity prayer, now I have the power of the third step prayer. And I can start to intermingle these. And now all of a sudden, my prayer life is got more than just the serenity.
You don't just have a prayer, you have a whole prayer life.
I've got.
So this prayer is not the starting line of step 3. You don't say, okay, I've done step 2, now I'll start step 3, and to begin, I say this prayer first. It's also not the finish line. It's not like, okay, I've earned the step 3 merit badge, and now I will pray this prayer and I will be done with it, kind of as a graduation ceremony from step 3 into step 4.
Right.
It's a tool to be used and personalized as needed for whenever you feel these kinds of things happening in your life again.
You're building a repertoire, and you're building a toolbox, not just learning a tool and you throw the rest of them away and only use your hammer now. Now you got a hammer and a screwdriver and a wrench. You're starting to build a larger arsenal of weapons, and that's what you're doing with your prayer life.
Now, does the step 3 prayer prepare me for step 4? Is there some kind of relationship there, or is it just kind of stand on its own in step 3?
Oh, I that's why the steps are in order.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, why don't you tell us one of these other prayers that you have here for us?
Oh, step 7 prayer. I like this one.
Okay.
Because step 7, and we haven't actually released this one yet in our sequence of events, but step 7 is the one where it says we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. And the step 7 prayer goes, my Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, both the good and the bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and to my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here and do your bidding. And so when we talk about the release of our shortcomings and our character defects, that corresponds with humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. That's great.
Yeah.
Great
Well, and
prayer.
prayer is how you ask God to remove your shortcomings, right? Like that's done in conversation with God. So the prayer to do that, like that is prayer.
Right.
So to have the prayer for the step
And,
X.
and the beautiful part about that is, I don't know what to ask for.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and I think there's such this commonality that just runs throughout our culture. Is somewhere along the lines we lost that people relating and yearning in a relational aspect of prayer, that it just became Rick's plan. I'm going to pray about it. And it was, I already have my plan. So when I pray, here's my plan. God, please endorse it.
Yeah.
Here, God, here's my plan. Would you just say it's okay? Check off my list. As opposed to the listening aspect that we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, of this podcast, which is, Lord, what is your will? I'll listen. Please make sure that we have a conversation just like you and your wife would, and then the two of you make an idea, come up with the plan together. And I have to listen to what it is that God says. He may tell me otherwise, and I have to have the wisdom and the discernment to listen, and he may change my plan, and it's not Rick's plan. So I have to be in tune to what it is that he's saying to me and go, okay, you're right. It's probably not wise based on my situation and my budget in what's going on for me to go out and buy a Maserati tomorrow.
Well, hey, if you got the money, I guess. I don't know. So part of me thinks that maybe these prayers would also be helpful for people on discipleship journeys, even if they're not in recovery.
Absolutely.
Say someone is curious about this following our conversation today. Where would you go to find these prayers? Can you just find them online? Do you have to buy a special book? Are they super secret?
Oh, they're not secret at all. All you have to do is go in and type in 12-step prayers and type in whatever step number you're on and just say 7th step, 5th step, 4th-step prayer, and you should be able to find them.
Okay. Well, why don't we wrap up our conversation there on prayer in recovery? And it is, thank you all for joining our conversation today as we've learned about prayer. If you have any other questions about this or any feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. I want to thank Rick again for joining us and for sharing deep wisdom and experience to enrich our lives and to shape this conversation. Thank you, and we'll hope you join us next time on The Conversation.
All right. Thank you.